Good morning. It is very good to be here with you today, but I'm going to confess I'm a little unbalanced because I'm alone here. Normally, my wife is with me. We love the fact that we get to go to church together week after week. Church may change, but I've always got the same redhead beside me during that process. Not everybody who works in the office has that same privilege. Their wives may be involved in medical care or something like that. That's not our case. However, we have children. They're grown. They live in other places, and one of them requires mama right now. So I'm here alone, and I don't have that person making sure that I've got water at the right moment and a breath mint and all of the other things. I had to dress myself this morning, for crying out loud. It's not easy, and yet I'm here and I'm delighted. I love this church, and I love Irishara being with us. This was kind of an exciting process to bring him to this church because things fell into place just marvelously, and we feel like that's the Lord's leading when all those things happen that way. When the barriers get swept out of the way of everything, you feel like, yeah, we're on the right path. This is good, and it feels wonderful. And somehow I managed to get through all this last week and end up right here, right now. And I'm just really hoping the Lord speaks this morning to all of us because I feel so unbalanced with everything that's gone on that it's tough to feel comfortable. I don't feel comfortable, but I want to talk to you about something really, really important to us all. That's a real short verse. You know, if I'd have known Mia was going to read, I might have given her a whole chapter because she's up to it. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Do you believe it? Do you feel it? I know I do. Short of the glory of God. No matter what I do and how hard I try. I want to talk to you about one of my favorite authors today. He's the gentleman in the middle. You might recognize the one over on the left-hand side there. That's Whitey Ford. He's in the Hall of Fame. If you're a baseball fan or like Matt, a Yankees fan for whatever reason, you might know that guy. The one on the right is the Bat Boy. You probably don't know him. I have no clue what his name is. But right there dead in the middle, the fellow with the dazed look on his face, that's George Plimpton. Anybody know who George Plimpton is? I see a couple of heads nodding out there. He was very famous when I was growing up. He's an author, highly intellectual. He was the founder and for nearly 50 years editor of the Paris Review, a literary magazine, which I've never even seen a copy of. But I learned much later on, as the world did, it was actually a front for the CIA. This guy was connected all over the place. And early in his writing career, he always had an interest in sports. In fact, he was a pitcher in high school, but tall, skinny, only about as athletic as anybody you might meet at church on any given Sabbath morning. And he began wondering, what would it be like to actually do what those guys do? Well, the only way to find out is to try it. And so he had some connections at Sports Illustrated. He talked to them and he said, I'd like to pitch against major league players. And they figured out a way to make that happen. The way was that there was an all-star game. It was at the end of the season. It wasn't the typical all-star game that happens in the middle. But somehow back in the early 60s, late 50s actually, there was an all-star game that was gathering. And Plimpton talked to both leagues, and they managed to get it arranged for him to go out and pitch. That's all. He would pitch entirely through the lineup. He was supposed to go all the way through the National League lineup and all the way through the American League lineup, but he only could get through one of those. He was exhausted by the time it was done because the way the rules were set up, he's going to throw the ball until somebody hits it. Well, all these guys just sat back and waited for a good one. And he wore himself out. So it went about as well as you would think it would go. He was giving up hits left and right. And one time he gave up a home run. You ever watch a pitcher when they give up a home run? They're looking at the ground. They do not watch anything. They're acting like nothing's going on, like they're not even in the stadium. Kind of do a little housekeeping, kick the dirt around a little bit. Not George. He turned around and watched that ball sail out of the stadium, and he had this kind of feeling of, as he put it, collaboration with the batter. It was an amazing sight, and he's like, look what we did. Wrote about it. And the experience caused him to say, I want to try this again, only he learned a lesson. He didn't do any real training. He kind of warmed up his arm a little bit and did a little pitching. Had to borrow a glove when he got to the stadium. He said, what if I really worked at it and got somebody to coach me and learned the sport well and then went out there? Would it make any difference? Well, if you were doing it, what sport would you want to try next? I tell you what I would not try. Not next, not ever. Boxing. The gentleman holding up the glove in victory is Archie Moore. Excuse me. Archie Moore at that time was the middleweight champion of the world. So he could hit. Interesting side note, later on he became a Seventh-day Adventist. Used to do a lot of work with inner city youth out in California. Oh, look. A replacement has been set in. Thank you. Oh, Susan thanks you as well. That helped. What he did was hire a trainer and arranged for 3 rounds against Archie Moore. But you ever know those people that weird things just happen to them in life? That was George. Anything can go wrong, it will. He was Murphy's Law incarnate. And so Archie Moore was willing to do this, but he and George happened to have a mutual friend who ran into the champ at a restaurant. And he said, hey, I hear you're going to box against George Plimpton. And he says, yeah, he's some writer. I don't know what it's all about. And he said, oh, you don't know? George is actually quite an accomplished boxer. He's an amateur, and he'd like to skip a few levels. He doesn't want to work through the low rounds, and he figures if he can do well against you, he'll start getting bigger purses. And the champ didn't care for that idea at all, and he says, I'm going to clean this guy up. And then the mutual friend could not convince him he was kidding. So when they rang the starting bell and George came out of his corner, here's the middleweight champion of the world ready to tear into him. It did not take the champ very long to figure out this guy's a writer. He wasn't doing his footwork right. He wasn't doing anything right. I mean, he was trying to remember what he's doing. Well, you know what it's like when you're trying to remember what you're doing so that you're not even focused on what you're doing? He figured that out real soon. And so he started actually coaching George. You ever watch these boxers? Sometimes they'll lock up with each other and the ref will have to come and break it up. He said he kept doing that to me, and he'd tell me things like, you need to breathe, man. Don't let your guard down. The guy who's fighting me is coaching me on how to do it. And in the second round somewhere, he said to the champ, you got to hit me. He says, I don't want to hit you. He said, I want to write about this. I want the whole experience. The whole experience means getting hit. He says, okay. And the next thing he did was to taste the canvas. Bam, he went down hard. Didn't knock him out. He managed to get up and stagger his way through the rest of the match. Then went back to his hotel room and, as he put it, with my head ringing like a telephone, I got out my typewriter and wrote the story. And the Atlantic picked it up, and it went national, and all of a sudden, overnight, everybody knew George Plimpton's name. And he invented what he referred to as participatory sports journalism, where I go out and I do it, and I write about what it is like for somebody with no specific talent to be in the presence of these amazing athletes and to do what they do. And the most famous thing he did was to train with the Detroit Lions. There he is, number 0. He said he was in that position a lot during training camp. He trained as a quarterback for the Lions, and it was done specifically to write the book for which he's best known, Paper Lion. And in the process of it, he just went through training camp and then spent one series of downs in a scrimmage. It was Lions offense against Lions defense. There wasn't even another team involved. And so the offense planned on all of the plays that he was going to do. And his first one was as simple as it could be. Hand it off to the running back. You couldn't mess it up, right? You take the ball from the center, you turn around and hold it out. That's it. When they actually got into the game conditions, even though he'd practiced this a bunch of times and everybody's walking through their right moves, he said under game conditions, everybody moves faster, except people who can't move faster. By the time he held the ball out over here, the running back was past him. Believe it or not, they train for that. There's a proper procedure. You tuck the ball in and you follow that guy, and you get as far as you can, which in George's case was not very far. He was met right at the line of scrimmage by a big rookie named Lucian Reberg. And he said he remembers hitting him, and then for a second or two didn't know what's going on, and he suddenly realized, my eyes are closed tightly, and my feet are off the ground, but running like a cartoon character who just went off a cliff. So he opens his eyes, and there he is, face mask to face mask with this guy who's looking in at him and smiling. He's got one arm around him, and for the other arm, he's feeling for the football to try and force a fumble. Well, fortunately, a bunch of other people crashed into him, and they fell down, and he didn't fumble the ball. But that's kind of the way his sports experience went. And George Plimpton's name was everywhere, and everybody wanted him to do stuff. And he trained with the Cole Brothers Circus and spent time as a trapeze artist and did a TV special about it. He went out and raced the Baja 1000 and wrote an article about it. Just all kinds of different opportunities came up for him to engage in this participatory sports journalism, to the point where, everybody was aware of him and watching his TV specials and reading his articles. And he even made it into a New Yorker cartoon. I should have gone out and tried to go out and get it so I could pop it up on the screen here for you. But there was a lady on a gurney being taken into surgery, and standing around are all of the doctors with the masks on. And she's looking up at them and saying to one of them, "Wait a minute, how do I know you're not George Plimpton?" You don't want that going into surgery, especially if you've seen him trying to, out there perform with the athletes. I think the craziest thing he ever did, other than the boxing, that was insane. But if there's anything more dangerous than boxing, well, I think Rodney Dangerfield put it best when he said, "I went to a boxing match and a hockey game broke out." Somehow somebody he was ready to quit, but somebody talked him into playing hockey. That's him on his face again. Number 00 this time. Twice as much of a zero as he was before. He was getting up there in years, and he'd never been a great skater, but Sports Illustrated came around and said, we want you to go and train and write a book about it. And he said, "I don't want to do it." And they said, "Too bad, you're going." And somehow he got talked into it, and he spent 5 minutes as a goalie in a game, an exhibition game, against the Philadelphia Flyers. He was with the Boston Bruins. Now, goalie that's crazy. I mean, in baseball, they call the catcher's gear the tools of ignorance, but, the goalie's outfit, it's made to keep you from getting killed, because that puck is much harder than a baseball and flies at about 2 to 3 times the speed. And so he got in there, and he said it was amazing, even during practice. He felt like he was always looking where the puck had just been, because he couldn't keep up with where it was at the moment. And he'd look over here and it was gone, and look over here and it was gone. And he was trying to tell by the movement of the players, and all of a sudden, where is it? In the net behind me. How did it get there? Nevertheless, he soldiered on, and he tried to learn what he needed to do, and he got in there and spent 5 minutes. Most of the time, the action was down at the other end of the rink. And so he had time to kind of do a little housekeeping, take his stick and move the ice shavings around, just kind of keep an eye on all the melee going on at the other end. And then suddenly he heard a noise, and the noise was the sound of a wave of players getting closer to him. Their skates clacking on the ice and their sticks bouncing off of each other. And then everything's happening all around him. And the Flyers scored. And then they scored again and again, about 5 times. And when there's just a few seconds left, one of his players committed a flagrant foul, he believes on purpose, so that he could experience one of the most horrible things a goalie has to face. And that's when one guy from the other team gets to come in one-on-one and do a penalty shot on you. All the other players have got to be back on the other side of the ice. It's just one guy and the goalie. And if you look at the picture there, you might just be, he's a little bit out of shot on yours. There's a guy by the name of Leach who's just out of shot right there, right up at the top in the orange. That's Reggie Leach. You may know the treasurer of the Arizona Conference, who happens to go by the same name. Reggie Leach was a good shot, and he's the one who got picked to do the penalty shot. So George is all ready for it to come, and Leach starts moving down the ice with the puck. And he was remembering his training, and one of the things you do is you move forward so that you cut down the angles on which he can shoot. You get bigger in relation to the goal behind you. And as Leach gets ready to take his shot, another thing that you do is, there's a couple of different defenses, but one of them is throw yourself down on the ice. Now the puck can't get under you. And you got your free hand with the glove on it to reach up and catch it or knock it down if he tries to shoot over the top of you. So Leach cranks back, and George goes down on the ice, and the shot ricochets off his skate wide of the goal. And his teammates go nuts. They go pouring out onto the ice and lift him on their shoulders, and it's bedlam in the stadium, and they're cheering, and nobody can hear what George is saying to his teammates, and so they had to wait until the article came out later on in Sports Illustrated. What he was trying to say to them was, I fell down. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, I guess, right? Well, that was it for him. He was not going to try any more sports. But you know, the burning desire to be among people who are really good at what they do, and to figure out what it's like to be among them, and to experience the same things, even if you're not at their level, was still there. And he said, I want to try one more thing where I participate and then write about it. But I'm not going to try any more sports. Too old, the body can't take it. So what's he going to do? George Plimpton joined the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. Now, you know, you don't just go out to the Yankees and say, I think I'd like to pitch for you guys. They're not going to put you into a game. Fortunately, they have exhibition games that you can go and participate in. But orchestras, none of us, well, I don't know, maybe there's somebody out here who would do it, but certainly not me, can walk up to Leonard Bernstein, the director, and say, I believe I'd like to play violin for you. That's not going to happen. But when he approached him and talked to him about it, what are we going to do? Bernstein says, I think I can find a place for you. You're going to go into the percussion section. If you can keep time, we can figure out how to use you. Well, he tried it, but here's the thing about Leonard Bernstein. He's a perfectionist. You don't mess up. George messed up. Even though he'd been practicing with everybody, there was an entrance that used a sleigh bell. What do you do with a sleigh bell? You shake it. And he didn't shake it to Leonard Bernstein's high standards. And he got thrown out of the orchestra. And he was barely getting started, and he says, I didn't have a story yet. I didn't experience anything yet. But he'd been around long enough to make friends. And he said it was just like working with sports teams. They kind of love the idea of somebody out there coming in here and joining us and writing about it for all those people. Especially the athletes. You think it's easy to, go up against the Chicago defense? Come on out of the stands and try it. Well, George came out of the stands and tried it. And this endeared him to everybody. And the musicians were the same way. And everybody in the percussion section is his buddy now. So they took him out to dinner to console him. And as they're talking, they said, you know what? This is just an artist's fit. He's a perfectionist, and he should be, and he's, really great and all that kind of thing. But we think we can talk him into letting you back into the orchestra. And George says, I don't think so. He was pretty specific about this. No, we're all going to work it out. So the next day, they file into his office, and they start pleading George's case. And George is kind of in the corner, real sheepish-like, and Bernstein is having none of it. This is his orchestra, and it is going to be to his standards. But after a little while, George thought he might be softening a little bit. So he dared to look up and face Bernstein, and he could see that he's thinking about it. And finally he said, all right, I'll tell you what. We have in about 3 weeks a concert in Winnipeg, Canada. And we're going to be doing Tchaikovsky's Second Symphony. I'm going to give you one note. And you will not play with the orchestra until that night except in practice. And you will practice that note. And you will get it right. And you will not mess it up. Get out of my office. They got out of his office. And George's one note was on a giant gong. 5 feet across. The kind that you get a big mallet and you swing and hit that thing and it's not quiet. But it's only one note. And he started practicing. You know how much there is to hitting a gong? You got to know where to put your feet, how close to stand in relation to the gong, what angle your body should be at in relationship to it. You got to know how to grip the mallet. You have to know how to swing, when to start your swing so that it will strike at the right moment. You have to know how hard to make that swing, and you have to know where on that gong to land the end of the mallet. And he starts practicing all of these things, and he said it was more intense than any other athletic competition I had been in my life. And all of his friends are coaching him on it and teaching him all the little nuances of hitting a gong. And he bought, this is back when record players were still a thing, he bought a little portable record player and an album that had Tchaikovsky's Second Symphony on it. And while he was traveling with the orchestra, in the evenings they're all playing and he's sitting in the audience, but then at night he'd get back to his room and he'd get out that record player and he'd put Tchaikovsky's symphony on there and he'd listen to it note by note, listening for his one moment on the gong. And he says, I know it must have driven all of the other musicians crazy because they're trying to rest up from a tough day, and they're done with music for the day, and then they hear wafting down the hallway of the hotel over and over Tchaikovsky's Second Symphony. But he said, nobody said anything. They were all on my side. They wanted me to succeed. Whatever it takes, George, we're with you. The night came in Winnipeg. George sat on a chair way back in the corner while the rest of the orchestra played the various different pieces that they had, waiting his time. When Tchaikovsky's symphony was up next, he stood up and got into his place. He got rosin on his hands and got that mallet and got his grip right and waited and waited and waited while they played the symphony right up to the crescendo, which was where his one note was going to be. And as they got down closer to it, he began to realize the principle of the section was counting off the time for me so I wouldn't get it wrong. And as they got down to his one note, Bernstein suddenly turned to him with his eyes bugging out, swung his baton right at him, and through his clenched teeth he hissed, "No!" At the same time, the principal of the section is saying to him, "Hit it!" And George swung that mallet and hit that gong harder than a gong has ever been hit. And he said the sound was so sudden and loud that the members of the orchestra in front of him jumped like beans on a hot griddle. And it echoed down to the back and moved up toward the stage again. So loud that Bernstein actually paused the orchestra for a full measure to let the sound die down so that people could hear the orchestra again. And George was crestfallen. He said it was the worst moment of my life. It was just a little bit too soon and way too loud, and he knew it. And he stood there with a mallet in his hands, an abject failure, looking at the ground and breathing heavily and feeling how much he had disappointed everyone. And then underneath the music, he heard a very soft sound. I didn't know this until I read this story, but musicians have a way of applauding each other. They shuffle their feet. And if you're like me and you're sitting out there, you don't hear it, but if you're up on that stage with everybody, you can hear if someone shuffles their feet to say, "That was a good solo," or, "Hey, that part you've been working on, you got through that smoothly." And George heard the distinct sound of an entire orchestra shuffling their feet and realized, that's for me. And he looked up directly into the eyes of world-famous conductor Leonard Bernstein, who was directing the orchestra with his hands, but his eyes were on George. And on his face was a smile. And he nodded and mouthed the word, "Yes." And when the music was over, the entire orchestra stood up with the audience and turned towards George in applause. And Bernstein insisted that he take a bow there in front of everybody. George Plimpton, who had failed at nearly everything except when he accidentally kicked a puck away from a net, was a one-note success. And a couple weeks later, he messed up something else and got thrown out of the orchestra again. But by now, he had his story. And he said forever afterwards, until his retirement, when Bernstein was in practice and he wanted the orchestra to really emphasize something, he would say to them, "Ladies and gentlemen, let us unleash the Winnipeg Sound." So that George's legacy lived on after him. Here's the thing. If all of the history of the human race, from the moment that God breathed life into Adam until the moment when he wipes every tear from our eyes, was a single piece of music, your life would be one note. And it wouldn't be something big like a note on a giant gong. Most of us are a little chirp on a piccolo, probably even during practice. Nothing anybody else would notice, but here's the thing. The conductor knows every note in the whole symphony. He knows what it is and where it goes and who's playing it. And if any of them are out of place or not played right or missed, you might not hear it out there in the audience, but the conductor knows. And he's paying attention to everyone. And here we are with our little chirp on a piccolo, trying to do best that we can with our one-note lives. How's it going? I mean, I try to do what George did. I practice at it. I work hard. I try to learn the nuances of it. I mean well. And I talk to people who I believe can coach me. And I try to pay attention to my director so that I can do well on my little one-note life. But you know what happens? There it is. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And I am constantly aware of the fact that I am short of the glory of God. And I can't be anything else. It is who we are, and no matter how hard we try, sin has entered this world and affected all of us. And the best among us are short of the glory of God. Now that's just a little verse there. But there's a lot in it. It describes the human condition as well as you are ever going to find it. If that were the end of the story, how tragic for all of us. But look what it says in 2 Corinthians 5:21. God made him. Who's he talking about? Jesus. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. But how? You know, that's a long subject. How? How does this happen? That Jesus becomes sin for me, I have fallen short of the glory of God, and he becomes it in such a way that I might become righteous like him, in spite of all of my best efforts falling short. That's a really long subject, and we don't have time to get into it today. That's the cop-out answer. Here's a more honest answer. I'm still working on it. I still don't fully understand how that happens. I don't expect I am going to fully understand how that happens, but I take it in faith that it happens. That God can look at my imperfect life and see his Son. And I believe it. Even if I don't feel it, even if I don't understand it, I believe it. Because I believe in him. And it's tough as we're trying to go through our one-note lives and falling short over and over and over to cling to that one simple thing, that Jesus saves. And there's not a thing I can do to make that happen. All I can do is reject it or accept it and continue to live my one-note life. Because someday I'm going to be in his presence. And I know something. I know something about that day. I know it now, but I'm going to realize it then in a way that I can't wrap my head around quite yet. And that is this. On that day when I am in his presence, I will know that I am a failure. How can we be anything less? We've all sinned. We fall short of the glory of God. And there's only one thing I want. There's only one thing anyone can want on that day. In that moment, the shuffling applause of the world will mean nothing. All I want to be able to do is look up into the eyes of my conductor and see a smile. And hear him say the words, "Well done. Well done, good and faithful servant. I gave you one note. And because of my son, in my ears, that note was perfect. Enter into the joy of your Lord."